Hello and welcome to week 6 of the course. This week we'll be talking about summative assessment. So far we've spent a good amount of time talking about formative assessment, and I'll be talking about how to submit your formative assessment assignment at the end of this lecture. First, let's talk about what summative assessments are. They're meant to assess student performance and document learning. So unlike formative assessment, they usually come at the end of a unit. They've got to be connected, just like the formative assessments, with your standards objectives for the material. Some examples of summative assessment are unit tests, final papers, written reports, presentations. They're generally much more formal than formative assessments in that they're graded. But whatever assessment we choose, it should give us a valid sample of whether students are meeting the objectives. So generally you can't test every single thing that you've taught, but you can pick a sample of questions to be representative of the material that the students have learned for the year or for the unit. This chart depicts some of the differences between formative and summative assessment, and is taken from a chart on page 146 of your book. First of all, the purpose for formative assessment differs than summative. When we're using formative assessment, we usually try to provide feedback during instruction. Often it's on the fly. Sometimes it'll be questioning students or student homework. The learning hasn't solidified, it hasn't ended, so we are trying to help students learn better. Summative assessment, though, usually comes at the end, and it's to document what the students have learned. That's why it's often graded. It can be used to plan instruction generally for the whole class. So you might do a reteaching lesson on some concept after giving a test, and you find out that the students mostly didn't learn that concept. Or you might be planning instruction for the following group, the following year. Formative assessment generally occurs during instruction, whereas summative usually takes place after instruction. The teacher's role is different for each of these. Again, formatively, we're talking about diagnosing and providing feedback on what students may already know and what they may need help knowing. Whereas summative assessment, your role is to plan, administer, and record performance to use for subsequent instruction. Student involvement, very encouraged in formative assessment. You're asking students questions, they're answering. You're encouraging them to do their homework. You're encouraging them to think about their learning. Student involvement in planning and doing summative assessment is sort of passive. They're just the takers of the test because the instructional unit is over, and so there's very little ongoing back and forth dialogue with the student. Student motivation, formative assessment, we talked about mastery oriented. You're trying to encourage students to master the learning objectives, whereas summative is much more performance oriented. So you're encouraging them to show what they've learned. Formative assessment is very learner oriented in that you're providing individualized feedbacks the way I've done in this course from time to time, whereas summative assessment is very group oriented. Structure, formative assessment is flexible, adapting, and summative assessment is generally more rigid and structured and formal and graded. Let's talk about some best practices to design summative assessment. Next week's lecture will be more about objective tests like multiple choice and true-false. But just in general, overall, how should you go about designing summative assessments? It's a good idea to use an assessment blueprint. And this is a map thinking about which objectives you've taught and which skills you want the students to master. You can see an example on page 148. You don't want to spend all your time teaching 5 objectives and only focus on one of them on the test. So a blueprint lays out the objectives and the questions, matches them up, and says, okay, how well does this cover the learning objectives? You have to think about the number of items, and generally your book recommends 5 to 10 question items to cover each learning target. You have to think about the time of your summative assessment, and this is based on the age of your students. Generally in pre-K, K, or 1, we only allow 5 to 10 minutes because their attention spans are shorter. You're probably not going to be given a lot of written tests at this age. You're probably going to be more performance-based. But again, the attention spans of the little ones are very short. Later in elementary school, you can extend that 15 to 30 minutes. In middle and high school, generally 30 to 50 minutes is a good benchmark. So how do you get started? Well, it's a good idea to begin creating the summative assessment before you're beginning to teach the unit. You vary the types of items on the test and consider the appropriate for performance assessments. Choose the type of test item that best aligns with the objective and content. So what I do is I lay out when I designed the final exam for this course, I laid out my learning objectives. And then I said, okay, well, what's the best way to measure each of these objectives? Do I want to use true, false, multiple choice? Do I want to use essay questions? Remember, essay questions cover objectives that are more complex better. And then I used my about 5 questions per learning objective rule, and then I make the questions. So, for example, if you have at the bottom, SWBAT means students will be able to. If you have students will be able to identify the colors of the rainbow, you might measure that with a short answer. What are the colors of the rainbow? Or you might say, list a bunch of colors and say, check all the colors that are in the colors of the rainbow. Students will be able to compare and contrast the 2 main characters of a novel. Well, that's much more complex, and that's probably going to be an essay question where you ask them to compare and contrast 2 specific characters. When you've done the questions for your test, you're going to write up instructions for each section. Directions must be clear, not overly wordy, and written at the appropriate reading level for the students. So you're not going to use the same type of directions in high school that you would for a 4th grade test. It's a good idea to be sure students are familiar with instructions and question types in advance. And before the test, students should be aware of what they're expected to know. You can do this by posting objectives or even sharing the blueprint that you've devised for the test. As I've done in other assignments, you should indicate point values, how much each question is worth. The presentation of the test is important, and so you should use a font size that is easily readable by your students. Some teachers prefer to have an answer sheet, and this works well starting at about 4th or 5th grade. So you would give them the test and have them write on the answer sheet. If you do choose to do it, have them record their answers on the exam, make sure to leave ample space to respond. That means room to circle their answers, room to write, lines that cue the length of the required answer. Some students take this very seriously and they'll only write as much as you give them room to write. So think about how much you want them to respond. Group the types of questions together, so all the multiple choice together or those about a particular topic should go together. Be sure to use proper grammar and spelling, and I will guarantee you that if you don't, you'll have a student point that out to you. Be sure the test or project detail is organized well on the page. So for example, if you have a question that comes at the end of the page and you don't have room to put all of the question at the end of the page, just move it to the second page. Don't break up questions from page to page because you'll have students who don't read the second part. Columns should line up, and this is especially important in matching and also in math. There's nothing more frustrating to a student to have to track where the column is. You should probably take the assessment yourself and time yourself. How long does it take you? Make a note of any confusion about the test as you take it and make corrections. Give it to someone else for feedback, another adult, a teacher, for example. And sometimes it's helpful to have a child of the age that you are targeting take the test to see in terms of readability, for example, Of course, if this is your own son or daughter, you're going to say you're just helping mommy and daddy out. It's obviously not graded or anything. Let's end with some test-taking tips. These are tips that you could use or you could teach to your students. Encourage your students to be familiar with the test format. So you could say to your students there are going to be 10 multiple choice and 10 true or false and 2 essay questions. And talk about how to do each one of those. Encourage adequate preparation and, of course, sleep and rest the night before the test. Allow them to practice with different types of test questions such as multiple choice, essays, and obviously other tests. The day before the test, you could give them a review session where you make up items that are not going to be on the test and they try to take them. This will not only prepare students for the test, but it will also encourage them to relax about the format. Encourage students that when they get the test, they should read all the directions, look at the scoring, scan the test and know the types of questions and budget the time accordingly. When you or your students take a test, be sure to read the questions carefully, underlining keywords. And you can actually practice this in class with students. Annotating diagrams. Sometimes students rush over directions and miss key important parts about understanding how to do the problem. Encourage students to do the easiest questions first, and then get to those with higher point values, and then to harder questions. So, for example, on the ALST, we encourage students to do to look at and do the multiple choice questions first, because you can rack up a lot of points that way. You've got to encourage students not to skip questions if they use this strategy. What I would do is I would tell my students to put a little mark by the ones they need to come back and finish. And at the end, after they've done the easier questions or the ones that they can do quickly, they should go back and do the ones with the mark. Encourage students to try to visualize information, diagrams, notes in their text, and diagrams and pictures and figures in their textbooks. There are some test-taking tips specific to multiple choice questions. Reading the questions again carefully and underlining keywords. Writing notes sometimes helps related to the information. What I like to do is I tell students to cover the choices and try to come up with the answers in their heads after reading the question before they look at the answer and choices. Read all the answer choices before selecting answers, and if they're unsure, they can try to eliminate incorrect answers by crossing out answers that they are sure are wrong, such as answers that are only partially correct. And it's important to emphasize that they should choose the best answer. This is typically a set of instructions that teachers will put on a multiple choice test. Choose the best answer. Some of the choices may seem a little correct, but one should obviously stand out as the best answer. More guessing tips. Sometimes one answer will be grammatically incorrect. So it might not match the stem. We call the question the stem. It might not match the stem. The stem and the answer choices should flow together. And if, for example, if you have the stem written in the past tense and the answer choices in the present tense, that's probably a pretty good sign that the answer is incorrect. If they have the same words used in the stem and the correct answer, that's a clue that that might be the correct answer. If all else fails, tell students to look for the longer answer, and it's often the correct one. Sometimes one answer choice includes all the others. That's usually the correct one. If everything else fails, again, more times than not, the correct answer is not going to be the first one or the last one. So if they have to just blindly guess the second or the third one, the one in the middle, they have a better chance of getting it right. Questions that use answers that use always are almost never right. So if they see always in an alternative, in an answer, they can probably eliminate it. You might be wondering why I'm focused on allowing students to guess like this. And it seems counterintuitive because we want students to understand the content and know the content. But there's nothing wrong with teaching them test-taking skills so that they can do as well as possible on the test. Constructed responses are those questions that we require students to write their answers out. So, for example, short answer or essay. Tips for taking constructive response questions are to make sure they answer everything that is asked. On the ALST, your certification licensure exam, one of the biggest problems we see students struggling with is that they will pick a side that they like, an argument, and only give one side of the argument, and they'll ignore the graph, whereas the graph supports specifically one side, and they'll ignore that graph, so they're not taking into account everything that is asked. Be sure again to answer each part. You could use headings in your answer to make sure you've answered the parts and make it easy for the scorer. They should pay attention to direction words like define, label, analyze, explain. And it's helpful to teach your students what these words mean. So define means to give a 1 or 2 sentence answer. Label means to write words, usually on a diagram. Analyze means to think deeper, break apart the components of an argument. And explain usually means to show your comprehension, to write something out in your own words. If it's an essay, it's helpful to students to make an outline first. Sometimes when I say outline, people think, oh, Roman numerals and number 1, letter A, but it doesn't even have to be that type of outline. It could be just a simple, quick outline using bullets. Matching column tips. This is the one that we're all familiar with, where you give a premise on the left side and then a response on the right side that has to be matched. So matching column tips, read the side with the longer phrases first. So the premise is usually what you read first. And pick out an answer in your head before reading the choices. Often you'll see the choice in the response column. And be sure that the answer matches the stem. For example, a person with a description of a person. Of course, you should encourage students when they finish to double check their work. A lot of times students will just finish and hop up and hand in the test, and then I always say, did you check your work? And kind of skim it over myself. Be sure that all questions and all parts are answered. Sometimes when you're skimming it over, you see they missed a whole page. Try not to overthink or second guess yourself. Only change an answer if you're sure it's incorrect. This is a problem with very bright students, advanced students. They'll overthink an answer. Often their first instinct is the correct one, and I tell them to go with their first instinct. So that was a little bit about summative assessment. We'll continue next week. I want to spend the rest of this lecture talking about the formative assessment assignment and how to upload it. It is due on the 16th. I need you to upload it as a Word document. The template was created as a doc. So you should be uploading as an attachment with a DOC or a DOCX extension to the link in the assignment folder on the course homepage. The reason I need you to do this is it's very difficult to grade and give feedback if you just copy and paste it into the window, or if it's uploaded and anything else, because often I can't upload it, I can't open it. If you have trouble doing this, we have an IT help desk line, and I've provided the number there. To upload, you'll go to the course homepage, click on the assignments folder there, and when you click on assignments, you'll see the formative assessment assignment folder at the top. You can click on that, and that will take you into the folder. The top link where it says submit work here is where you need to click. When you click on the Submit Assignment link, you'll be taken to a screen that looks like this, with the due date October 16th, again just before midnight, the points possible 15, and at the bottom you'll see under number 2, Write Submission. That's not where you click, because that's to allow you to copy and paste your text. Instead, what I'd like you to do, please, is click on Browse My Computer and attach your file as a Word document. The template was created again as a Word document, so you should have saved it as a Word document. Check the file extension. These are the 3 or 4 letters that occur after the dot in the file name. It should say DOC or DOCX. Attach it by clicking on the file from your computer, and it will upload and submit properly. So if you have any questions, again, I've provided the IT helpline, and I hope that you're able to do this and that you benefited from this assignment. I hope you have a great week. Next week, we'll be talking about your summative assessment assignment and more then. Talk to you later. Thank you.